Opening opposition, we have Oxford A.
Oscar will be first, he is he, and Jack second, he or they is fine.
Closing government, Leiden A.
David will be speaking first, he prefers he. Emma speaking second, she please.
And closing opposition, Tel Aviv B.
Hi, Gil speaking first, here they please.
Sam speaking second, no preference.
And in the panel, my name is Melda. I'll be your chair, and I prefer she or they. And with me in the order of the draw, Elia, Jessica, Nick, and Sajid. Could you please introduce yourselves and your preferred pronouns?
Eli, here they please.
Just she or they.
Nick, here they, fine. Sajid, here they, please.
Perfect. We obviously prefer if you refer to the panel as a whole. And without further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister.
Hi, am I audible? Yep, lovely. Just 1 second because I have quite a bit of paper and then I'll begin. Thank you. Am I still audible? Just making sure before I jump in. Lovely. I'll be starting in 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Water is what nourishes life and gives individuals the ability to access literally everything else in the world. We think that it's principally abhorrent that in the status quo, the access and the ability to manage water properly has been screwed over by states, by corporations, by other actors who have been unable to do this well. We'll be explaining 3 things in this speech. First, why there's a principled right to access water, and therefore to the extent that we're able to improve access, we're going to win this debate. Secondly, how this massively improves the management of water resources, saves lives, and creates many useful goods on the ground. Lastly, how this deflates dangerous fights over scarcity of water geopolitically, helps save lives, and broadly creates a much better future. Before that, a 5-part model. Very quickly, we parallel the management and sharing of these resources to the OPTIC, which is already currently internationally shared amongst different countries. The international body that carries out this management will have 5 characteristics. The first is that the international body would have a certain degree of sanctioning power to enforce the things that we're going to talk about later. There'll be an ability to sanction countries. There'll be courts similar to the WTO where dispute resolution can be carried out. Secondly, policy within this international body will be influenced on a degree of equal voting from different countries, which means smaller countries and other states will all have equitable representation, no veto power, no messed up stuff like that within this space. Thirdly, there'll be 3 main functions that this body carries out. The first is the distribution of natural water resources that are collected and distributed equitably on a needs-based standard. This looks like, for instance, salination projects that are carried out near the sea that allow for water to be then redistributed to other places on the needs basis. That's why, for instance, thirsty individuals within Yemen right now would, for instance, be the priority of this redistribution after this body gets these resources. Secondly, the ability to manage water correctly. This looks like clearing out environmental issues within the water, decreasing pollution, getting rid of oil spills, and things like that. Lastly, the management of flooding and water in places like Bangladesh, where the monsoon every year in Dhaka literally causes many life loss and destroys so much infrastructure. We think that this has, like, the jurisdiction of this body also covers that. 3 arguments, therefore. Firstly, why the right to access water is a principled good, and why, in particular, we think no country has a claim over it, and therefore the international body principally should do it. 3 reasons. First, the arbitrary distribution of the globe itself and the way countries are actually carried out mean essentially that it's principally arbitrary that some countries have the right to be bordered by water bodies and some countries are not. In particular, your geographical location is quite often outside of your control, yet many landlocked states face extreme harms and face extreme difficulty in accessing water. Secondly, the fact that water is literally the prerequisite to living and literally the prerequisite to access any other higher right of the individual. That is to say, without water, you thirst off, you die, and you're unable to access greater things in life, which is why access to water is so key. But lastly, to the extent that every water body borders multiple countries. No country uniquely has a principal stake or principal claim to that water body in general. We would posit, therefore, that an international body is principally needed to ensure access of water. How do we ensure access of water? I think this is quite simple, right? To the extent that quite often in the status quo, there are three perverse incentives for the mismanagement of water resources, we change that. I think the first is just broadly the equitable access of water is quite hard because this is not a priority within specific states. This looks like, for instance, the fact that water within places like Bengal and India have to be sold under the informal economy in unhygienic means because the state simply does not have the incentive to do things like promote infrastructure, like build clean sanitation facilities, like provide things for these people, because the way the political systems that these places are structured mean that these rural areas don't get any voting power. The urban rural divide screws over these people and prevents that. Secondly, governments are weak and unable to ensure that water is well enforced. This is not only a problem of resources in terms of the fact that many governments themselves do not have the ability to build infrastructure to enforce this, but it's also a matter of corporate capture to the extent that loss of pollution is carried out in these places that make the water extremely dangerous to drink. Governments quite often have inherent incentive to have economic boom to promote their own popularity, which means that they're unlikely going to take away these corporate bodies. B, the rampant corruption of these corporations mean essentially that they're able to push for these things and stop governmental change. Thirdly, at worst, like your judicial system within many of these places are toothless and have the inability to enforce at worst a fine against these companies that is ineffective in changing that. That leads to extreme degrees of water pollution within many places that screws up these water bodies and has huge effects in terms of individuals. Third reason, and I think this is particularly crucial, to the extent that quite often governments are unable to have the funds to do these things, it also means the mismanagement of water bodies in times of crisis. This is in particular due to the fact that under global warming, the changes of temperatures become much more certain and storms and things like that become far more common under the El Nino effect. This looks like underlying areas quite often not having the correct management of water dikes and things like that are common in the Netherlands because they have the resources, but not in Bangladesh. This looks like yearly floods and flash floods and monsoons that happen around South Asia because the governments are unable to manage these water bodies. To the extent that we change that by implementing an international body with the resources collectively pulled from around the world to do this, we think comparatively we're able to do this better. This body is also not susceptible to corporate lobbying by its nature, but more importantly, we argue that structurally this body is also not susceptible to specific abuse and capture by one state because of the fact that all states have equal stake within this body. The fact that if one state tries to abuse it, other states will call them up because they're self-interested and they do not want to lose out in terms of this. This is exactly why the shared management of the Arctic has not led to any state exploiting the oil resources within because of the shared equity policy and because states don't want a race to the bottom. Therefore, on the comparative, we are far more able to do many good things like helping the environment, getting rid of toxins that literally help affect the lungs and the skin and the lives of people on the ground. We're far more able to stop flash floods that destroy infrastructure, prevent cities developing, and prevent economy from growing. We're far more able to distribute water and literally let people live and let people grow up and consume healthy water that they don't get on that side of the earth. I think that's broadly a good thing as well. Before I move on to my last point, I'll take a POI from closing.
Are you going to do the same for agricultural produce, healthcare, all the things that are as important to life and are as impacted by global warming?
I think broadly speaking, right, to the extent that if a motion requires us to equitably distribute these things in order to save lives, we're happy to do that. I think in principle consistency that is fair. But this motion specifically talks about water and I think we can broadly do a lot of good things. Lastly, why is water extremely dangerous politically? Because of the way water is principally arbitrarily divided among states, it means that, as I mentioned earlier, states have like unequal access to water. What this does is water becomes an extremely important geopolitical flashpoint when states fight over it for scarcity when distribution is not ensured. This looks like, for instance, the border disputes in the Mekong River between China and Vietnam because individuals are fighting over control over that specific water body. It looks like China using the supply of Dongjiang water to Hong Kong to hold the city to account to the extent that we're unable to get our own water. And there are no alternatives for these people on that side of the house, to the extent that broadly some places literally don't border the sea and can't get any other water. Look at how Malaysia has been causing many tensions with Singapore because Singapore has to buy water from them, but also salination plants within countries themselves is quite hard to do individually, to the extent that land is limited and salination processes require extreme amounts of land to build up the factories to get the water desalinated. We think that on the alternative, the scarcity of water leads to extreme conflicts and people dying on the ground. This has literally happened in history. Ultimately, we save immense amounts of lives, we prevent pollution, we allow for the worst of excesses to stop development and human life from growing. For those that are much less fortunate than us, we beg you to propose.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech. And we would like to welcome the leader of opposition. Hear, hear.
Panel, I'm going to do 3 responses to opening government on their mechanism, on why this does not improve management of water and why this is worse for geopolitical struggle, before talking about 2 points of substantive. Firstly, how this restricts the use of water for actually important development goals and other goals. And secondly, why this results in the effectively private operation of water in the developing world and why this is bad. On opening government, I think it is a bit cheap for opening government to mech in an equal basis, equal footing, perfect international system, unlike literally no other. But I am willing to say that even if facially there is an equal system, there is structural bias that can occur even with facially equal shares. Things like we're not going to trade with a country unless they vote for us. I just don't think you can factor in complete equality in the amorphous goal on their side of the house. But why does this not improve management of water? I think this is going to point out the clash I'm going to get to later on. They say the government has no incentives because of like bad political systems. I mean, to some extent this is true, but I think the comparative, as we're going to show you, is actually a large degree of corporate private TNC control over water resources. And I think the fact that those TNCs actually have literally no domestic stake in things like stability or development, and secondly, massive profit incentives and no electoral mechanism, that actually means that there are worse incentives for these actors on our side of the house. But on geopolitical struggle, I have 2 points. Firstly, we can put sanctions in. I mean, good shit, so can the Security Council. They rarely do because backhand deals mean that they don't, because even if you have like a sanctions body that is equal, they can just trade or threaten not to trade with each other. So you have blocks forming, right? And we're also going to show you why those blocks disproportionately form for the developed world. But secondly, to the extent that you do have sanctions, this is even worse because an international water body can be leveraged by China, not just for Hong Kong now, but for Sudan. So if China wants to do Belt and Road infrastructure in Sub-Saharan Africa, they can say, we're not going to allow this water project to go through because of the political capital we have, we're not going to fund it, instead of only being able to, do projects that flow on through the Yangtze or the Yellow River. On to 2 points of substantive, why this restricts use of water for important means and why this effectively privatizes or private operates water. I want to know, when OG said people are starving, wait, no, people are thirsty, this showed the lack of political capital for the actually important uses of water in the developing world. People want water because of thirst, because of drought, because of the environment. No, water is important for things like hydropower in developing countries that need electricity. It's important for intense irrigation in these countries, and these political narratives simply don't accrue to the projects that are actually beneficial. 3 points. Firstly, why the West has disproportionate influences. I mean, obviously, like funding, right? Secondly, I mean, structural bias and the ability to leverage, and also the fact that I don't buy there is just a mech of equal shares. But even if we do, 2 other reasons. Thirdly, control of other international institutions that will co-fund these projects like the World Bank. And fourthly, you can just leverage the power of money in like withholding trade deals or like, forcing countries to align with you because of other mechanisms that you have outside. That means the West will have greater political power over these bodies. And importantly, most countries in the West have large wholesale corporate interests, and not only corporate interests, but even the popular interests are problematic for the following reason. Certain narratives about water are much more politically potent, right? And this is highlighted by the lack of certain examples used by opening government. Thirst, drought, even just like this whole green sail environmental concept, this amorphous water is the sustenance of life principle. No, there are realistic things like, the economy from tanneries, hydroelectric power, things like water intensive irrigation for like cash crops that are incredibly important for the developmental stages of these countries. And because these narratives have much less political capital, it's much more difficult for countries like the United States to say we are investing in this body so that Sudan can build a hydroelectric plant. It is much better if they're able to use their white savior narrative on the American people to say, we're going to go in and give the Sudanese water that they need and save the environment. This is the problem. The prioritization is harmful because it is not necessarily the most effective. Because we would posit the amount of water redistribution you need for things like thirst is actually relatively low. The amount that you need for things like environmental outcomes is so amorphously high that you are able to just disproportionately redirect resources away from actively effective means that are not politically palatable. But secondly, you then redirect funding from other goals. So for example, if the US has a say in the Water Management Board and water is seen as an environmental variable, then the US is able to much more easily say, we're going to stop South Sudan misusing its water supply, instead of funding things like the Paris Agreement, where there are actually alternatives that are more difficult to fund and more difficult to feed narratives of. This means that there is less funding for even environmental goals, on top of the fact that there is worse prioritization of water. Closing.
So you say the World Bank is still going to be needed to build a hydro dam in Sudan. So I'm really uncertain how the US will get more power if they're necessary under both sides of the house for Sudan to get a hydro
But the World Bank also has a massive stake in the US. It's why its headquarters are in Washington and why it follows Washington-based policies. It's like, I thought that was common knowledge, but maybe that's just me. Secondly, on the effective private operation of water, the status quo in the developing world mostly is that water is nationalized because the infrastructure is relatively old, but it is also quite expensive to run these water plants. You're gonna have to take that away to some degree when you invest power in an international body. The problem is that international bodies, and this is where OG's mechanism falls completely apart, do not have detailed expertise over national water infrastructure to manage. They don't often have like intense legal known language teams. They don't have knowledge of decentralized local actors, of like infrastructure specific to certain countries, or pre-existing deals between like the water ministry and the environmental ministry in a lot of these countries. International organizations also cannot partner necessarily with state actors because state actors are likely to be incredibly uncooperative at the point where a shift away from the status quo is necessarily bad to them. And even if like some states benefit from this, they're not the states with the water under the status quo. So the ones with water that need to cooperate are the ones that don't want to cooperate because they're going to get a loss from the status quo under their side. So that means that you necessarily tend to cooperate with private actors. And this usually looks like private actors with large amounts of money, transnational corporations or investment firms, and those with expertise like local arms in the country, which tend to be the larger ones. This is why the Green Climate Fund from the Paris Agreement is so heavily criticized because it relies on huge public-private partnerships. That means there is a large degree of control to private corporations with at least three harms. Firstly, there are vested TNC interests in other things like mining, which will lead to actually worse water outcomes because you tolerate things like pollution in the water because it's more effective for you. Secondly, private corporations don't factor in the very social value of water, so they only sell it to the people that can pay the most money, which is exactly the incentives problem that OG wanted to run about Bengal. And thirdly, private companies will tend to invest where it is the most profitable, not the most speculative, because they want to hedge their risk necessarily, whereas the government at least gets some social return, even if it's not a monetary return from investing in low water areas. And even if this doesn't happen, the only way it doesn't happen is if the government refuses to consent. So it's either the government consents and these harms accrue, or the government does not consent and thus faces backlash, which is what OG wanted to say, and also doesn't get these water funding projects that are now being pushed on it by other TNCs and other nations. For these reasons, because water is valuable, but for the right reasons, we are proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech. And would like to welcome Deputy Prime Minister to continue their case. Here.
Hello. Sorry, my mic was off. Am I audible? Okay, I will not be turning on my video because my Wi-Fi is quite bad. Yeah, so I will be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, the problem with Oxford A in this debate is that the vast majority of their attacks are not to our arguments, not to our principles, but to our model. If I can defend our model and show that it's a plausible and better comparative than everything that happens in status quo, I think Oxford A are already out of this debate. There are two quibbles that they have in terms of our model. The first is that they say our international body will come under political capture, and second, they say our international body will come under private corporate capture. Two things, I want to respond to each in turn. Firstly, on the political capture of international bodies. So I want to note that Oscar spends the first 2 minutes of his speech telling you that China will use the international body to hurt small countries, and then at the end of his speech says that the West has disproportionate influence. I think what this means is that by virtue of there being both China and the West, we thought that the sort of influence could balance each other out, and we thought that to the extent that institutions like IMF, the World Bank, and how we deal with the Arctic are already examples on our side of the house, we thought it was incredibly uncharitable on their side of the house. But second, the reason we told you why there will not be insidious interest by the West to go in and just steal resources was because of the intense media scrutiny. That means that it's far harder for you to politicize water because now the international body comes under a lot more scrutiny at the point to which there are less lobby groups and there are less like backhand deals. But most importantly, right, we argued that the West cares about its image, which means that the West has no reason to want to deny water to people in rural areas, or for instance, the West has no reason to want to deny water to Singaporeans like me because the West actually cares about its image in a way that, like, for instance, Mahathir does not. That is why we think that just because there is a disproportionate influence by the West in these international bodies does not mean that the West will have perverse incentives. But what does Oscar say to this? Oscar says, you know what, it's actually bad to focus on giving people water because we should actually focus on giving people hydroelectric power. I mean, That is just disingenuous, right? And I think it's incredibly rude because he says, you know what, the problem with status quo is not really access to water. It's just a small problem. I think it ignores all of Joshua's analysis that many people in very rural parts of the world simply do not have access to water, right? Because water is simply so expensive at a point to which some countries are able to monopolize that water and sell it to other countries at very expensive rates, which means that those national governments then have to pass on those costs to individual consumers, which means that many rural individuals and many poor individuals simply have no access to water. That is something that they cannot trade off on their side of the house. We thought it was incredibly elitist. But second, we thought that above and beyond that, right? I'm just not sure why his argument is comparative. Because is he seriously suggesting that the South Sudan government on his side of the house would somehow therefore invest in hydroelectric power? I think what Josh tells you is that the international body is particularly the mechanism for investing in things like hydroelectric power or investing in things like building dikes, for instance, because they have the unique capital and resources to be able to engage in these types of like investments, right? Things like, for instance, the desalination of salt water so that we can increase access to drinking potable water was something that was very important, not just for developing countries, but even for developed countries to the extent that areas like Flint, Michigan and US are still facing a lead water crisis. That is why we thought access to water was particularly important and something Oscar could not trade off. Therefore, in terms of the political capture of the international body, we thought we won. But more importantly, right, I want you to note that the argument is not comparative. Because if his argument is the international body can be captured by certain political actors, then it's not due if Joshua's comparative, that on their side of the house, individual governments are subject to far more corporate capture and you have far less ability to do anything about it because of the asymmetry of power. That is why on the consideration of political capture, opening opposition is out. Then they say, but you know what? The independent body will now come under corporate ownership and therefore there will be perverse incentives. Two things. Everything that we've said earlier means that I think it's possible for us to fiat some degree of regulations. But second, they can't just assert to us that corporations means bad, because we argue that corporations oftentimes and public-private partnerships are not an a priori bet in this debate. He can't just like play it on intuition pumps and say corporations therefore bad. We argue that many corporations are important and many public-private partnerships are particularly important because they provide efficiency, right? But most importantly, right, we argue that many of these corporations do not come under the same perverse political incentives. And that was something that we thought was particularly important because to the extent that many TNCs and public-private partnerships have things like profit incentives, even in their worst-case scenario, we thought it was still better than the counterfactual. What was the counterfactual? The counterfactual was one in which water could be politicized, was one in which, by virtue of Malaysia arbitrarily owning most of the water basins in Southeast Asia, they could simply therefore hold Singaporeans hostage because they said that Singaporeans didn't deserve water. Even in the worst-case scenario, that the international body comes under the capture of corporate and TNC ownerships, we thought that was still important because at least these corporate and TNC ownerships only incentives is to make money. And the best way to make money is to increase supply of water to as many individuals as possible, which is what leads to things like investing in desalination to increase the access of water whatsoever. That is why we thought it was far better. But the most important thing on their side of the house that they failed to deal with is the counterfactual. And I think they need to deal with the counterfactual. The counterfactual we presented to you was two main harms. The first was the wanton pollution of water and river basins in the developing world by big companies like ExxonMobil, whose oil spills in the Niger Delta largely went unregulated by the Nigerian government. For the two reasons Josh tells you, right? A lot of these governments come under corporate capture because they prioritize short-term economic incentives over long-term environmental benefits. But also second, because of things like settlement deals, which means that there's gag orders and reduced scrutiny and backlash. We thought that independent body was particularly important because at the very least on the comparative, there is far less political pressures on these independent panels. We thought that was a unique benefit that OO doesn't clash with. Before I move on, I want to take a point from closing opposition.
Why not just rely on a free market like exists today in the world?
Okay, if your model is the free market, I suggest that it's particularly fucked up to the poor because the poor will never be able to access a free market. That is why we think even if like there's some sort of public-private partnerships, at the end of the day, having that public international body having the ultimate scrutiny over was something we thought was particularly important because at the very least, they are more likely to do things like give access of water to the poorest individuals, even if these individuals cannot afford it. At the very least, making this like cheaper for rural people, which we thought, once again, on the point of access, was particularly important. But the last thing Oscar says is, you know, these international actors don't have like much expertise, but we think that once again, they can work with like hydroelectric power experts, so on and so forth. But the last thing I want to reiterate to you, panel, is the principle that I don't think OO deals with. That the principle of right to access water is not something that can be monopolized by unfettered free markets or cannot be monopolized by individual governments. Because water is something that is the fundamental underpinning of our lives. And it is principally arbitrary that our access to water is purely determined by our geographical locations. It's purely determined by the borders we call nation states. We thought that that was particularly problematic. We thought that the unfettered access to water was something that every individual has a right over. And that is the reason we're proud to advance. Thanks.
Thank the speaker for their